Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us at the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism, Building Solidarities. My name is Hijin Park, and I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Brock University. I will be moderating this plenary on addressing racism in the classroom. This land acknowledgement that I'd like to share with you today was written by Angelica Panglin Linan. She is a sociology undergraduate student at Brock University. And at a recent meeting of the Sociology and Criminology Students Association, she shared this land acknowledgement. And she's quite open and happy that I would like to share this with you today. Angelica writes, "We encourage everyone in this meeting today to reflect on their roots, origins, and the land that they occupy, and think about how our ways of life impact other communities. We must remember to recognize that we're living on stolen land. Most of us are settlers, some are indigenous, we are newcomers, we are immigrants and migrants. At Brock University, we acknowledge the land we gather on is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Whether we're on campus or not, we must acknowledge that the land we're on is a result of colonization and violence. In doing this, we are grateful to live on this land, and we respect and recognize the resilience, past, present, and future of the Indigenous peoples." Thank you, Angelica, for these thoughts. This space at the National Forum will be inclusive and safe. By participating in today's events, you're agreeing to acknowledge and recognize that we must all strive to challenge historical and divisive biases, treat all people with dignity and respect, trusting that everyone has come to the forum to learn, grow, and share. Be open to learning, recognizing that the best way to understand the choices, actions, or intentions of one another is by asking questions. Care for ourselves and each other. Acknowledge that heavy conversations can impact our mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being, and that it's okay to ask for help and support. This plenary work will critically examine how interactions within the classroom may ostracize Asian and IBPOC students, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and the interconnections between the classroom, the university, and society. We have 5 speakers with us today, and they have been asked to reflect on a number of questions. And each speaker will take turns addressing each question. After they have spoken, we will have some time for audience questions if you would like to submit these in chat. We have with us today Parsa Alirezaei. Parsa Alirezaei is an undergraduate political student at Simon Fraser University. He's often critical of the pedagogical practices and political economic structures that constitute the academy. He is part of the Caucus, a student collective in pursuit of dismantling harmful narratives in and around the academy. Writing about bourgeois ideology and how it informs our understanding of social space is his current hobby. He's also an editor-in-chief of Gadfly Undergraduate Journal of Political Science. We also have with us today Hela Bakhtari. Hela is a current graduate student in the political science program at the University of Toronto, where she also holds a research assistant position with the Factor Inwentash School of Social Work. In past positions, she has been a compliance analyst for the G20 Research Group and a research assistant with the World Health Organization Collaboration Center for Governance, Accountability, and Transparency in the Pharmaceutical Sector, where her position's main objective was assisting the WHO CC's project, including her recent collaborative publication For Whose Benefit? Transparency in the Development and Procurement of COVID-19 Vaccines. We also have with us today Heunjung Lee. Heunjung is a Korean immigrant and a Ph.D. candidate in performance studies at the University of Alberta. Funded by Shirk Doctoral Fellowship, her interdisciplinary research performing abnormal, reframing aging minds and bodies, investigates the challenges, ageist and ableist cultural images and rhetoric of old age and people who live with dementia. She teaches undergraduate drama performance courses at the University of Alberta. She is interested in developing an inclusive and decolonial pedagogy enacted through course syllabus, material, project assignments, and assessments. She has served in CATR Anti-Racism and Anti-Oppression Committee and Mile Zero Dance EDI Equity, Diversity, Inclusivity, and Accessibility Committee. We also have with us Dr. Reece. Dr. Reece is Assistant Professor of Sociology at X University. Dr. Reece is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work examines how carceral processes in Canada are organized and maintained through historical and contemporary narratives of colonial violence and white settler capitalism. Her work also explores how community based ethnographic pedagogy can be a tool for abolition and activism, as well as a contested field of praxis. Recent publications include It's Not Just About Work and Living Conditions, The Underestimation of the COVID-19 Pandemic for Black Canadian Women, with Dr. Melanie Knight and Renee Ferguson. In 2020, Dr. Reece was honored as one of the 100 accomplished Black Canadian women. Dr. Megan Scribe. Dr. Megan Scribe is Assistant Professor of Sociology at X University. Dr. Scribe is an Inuit Ixwe from Norway House Cree Nation. She's an interdisciplinary Indigenous feminist researcher, writer, and educator. Her award-winning dissertation, Indigenous Girlhood, Narratives of Colonial Care in Law and Literature, examines how legal and literary narratives shape knowledge on violence against Indigenous girls living under settler colonialism. Dr. Scribe's research interests include indigeneity, systems of power and oppression, and Indigenous worlding through speculative fiction and poetic inquiry. Dr. Scribe is also an Associate Research Fellow with Yellowhead Institute and a Council member for Aboriginal Legal Services Community Council Diversion Program. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And let's begin with question number 1. The question is, can you tell us how issues of race, racism, and anti-indigeneity manifest in the classroom? And we will begin with Dr. Reece.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 13, specifically in Scarborough. That is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And of course, a part of our larger Takaranto Turtle Island. So this is a great question. And what I'm going to try and do is I want to situate my land acknowledgement in terms of an ontological pedagogical practice. So I'm hoping that my responses are taken up and offered in a way that really demonstrates how I try and practice teaching and learning my pedagogical philosophical lens around decolonization in the classroom. So in the spirit of that, that is the way in which I'd like to situate my responses. So how does racism show up in classrooms? Well, because we live in a racist society. I'm borrowing here from Frantz Fanon, who says that, you know, either your society is racist or it's not, right? There's not a kind of a liminal space in between. So because we live in a racist society, of course, classrooms are microcosms of our society. It shows up in a number of ways. And some key ways that it shows up are in student resistance to material, particularly around social justice, or material that specifically is talking about the colonization of Indigenous and Black folks in Canada and the construction of the nation state. So because the fabric of racism is so entrenched and embedded in these socio-political structures, of course it's going to show up in the classroom. But what I find really interesting is not only does it show up in resistance from students, but it also shows up in resistance from leadership, and the leadership are the faculty, right, or the teaching assistants or your instructors. And so this is really important because what is said and what is not said is indicative of the positionality in which someone is going to enter into a conversation that investigates the workings of racism, particularly around anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, right? So I think when we think about different iterations of racism in the context of the classroom, it's also really important to understand that deficit thinking or lack of movement around engaging in conversations around whiteness and white supremacy are just as damaging. So what is said and what is not said is equally important if we're going to have these conversations. And I guess I want to use this opportunity, and we could probably come back to this, but to talk about the way that racism shows up in a way that's not really popular, or it might be considered controversial, and that is in the sense of white proximity or white adjacency. And so I want to frame this issue in terms of what we're seeing in our current political climate. And of course, the way that racism shows up online and the visceral attacks and the incidences of racial violence that students and faculty have experienced in the online platform is not only horrendous, of course, but it really speaks to a larger political and cultural positionality of what's happening in our current environment. And so there are and there have been situations, and we need to talk about this, of students who are racialized that are participating in projects of anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism. And we seldom talk about that. And that's the larger complexity around having this conversation, is how do we take that up and how do we deal with and take up those tensions and those complexities when that form of lateral violence is taking place in the context of the classroom, particularly when it's happening online, and particularly when folks are feeling emboldened because of the anonymity that online teaching presents, and the way in which it's so hard to manage that space. Not to say, of course, it doesn't show up in the physical classroom space as well, as of course it does, but the way in which it's contested and understood and communicated is different, and we're seeing such an increase in that kind of racial violence and terror in the online classroom. So I just wanted to start really broadly by situating my comments in that vein, and hoping that we can have a more fluid and fulsome conversation around some of those salient pieces.
Thanks so much, Dr. Reece. There's so much to pull from there. Parsa?
Thank you, Hijin. Thank you, Dr. Reece. I would like to talk about institutional racism, specifically how the classroom is constructed before students and instructors enter its space, and it's on an institutional level. And we started off broad, and we should, and I would like to go from the very broad to a very specific manifestation of this. And a rather relevant example, perhaps, is how instructors achieve the scope of a course, a class. What is and isn't appropriate given the topic of conversation when it comes to foundational courses, especially. And I define foundational courses as courses with a title that imposes a mandate so broad it can constitute an entire field or subfield of study. These are introductory courses. A lot of undergraduate courses are introductory courses. Most of the time, these courses exclude anything remotely critical of the status quo, or they dangerously, and I do especially find this dangerous, place critical thought in the margins of the syllabus. And that includes discussions of race and on race. And what this does is establish a paradigm and an ideological map, if you will, of everything related to the course. And if it's a foundational course, this process will set the stage for an everlasting conflict between racialized students' social reality and what they come across in the classroom, especially if they're working class. And this is a very, very important point I'd like to, emphasize, especially if they're working class, the contrast between what they experience and as part of their social reality and, the sort of deterritorialized academy is like a horrendous problem. Um, and classrooms are spaces where the question of class is stuffed into the realm of the apolitical and often left unaddressed. I've had examples, in seminars where, for example, I'm in a seminar right now on climate change and internet in politics, climate change politics. And for the first couple of weeks of the course, I genuinely tried to introduce, and there were topics like Hurricane Katrina and its impact on, international relations. You learn a lot about, the field of study and the ideology in which you're kind of examining the world through, by who's fundamentally excluded from the conversation of this stuff. For example, until I brought up a note, like just constantly almost annoying the class about, the femicide factor, the genocidal factor, the ecocidal factor, to climate change and international relations, first of all, I'd be acknowledged. The point will be acknowledged, and then it will be further acknowledged as not a part of the scope of the course. So it's a very, very, active process. Um, at first, it might be implicit, but as soon as, Dr. Reece talked about resistance, whenever that resistance manifests, rather than making an explicit counter reaction, it's more of a hearken towards, like, this is just not the right space or not the right time. This is not the right scope. You need to find the right space for it. So to investigate racism in the classroom, one would have to look at all things apolitical as if they were the most political thing they've come across. And in the spirit of furthering this cliche of angry brown kid makes everything political, I believe the given stuff, the norms of the classroom, like the instructor student relation, the producer consumer relation, which is a fundamental byproduct of a neoliberal academy, and expert novice relation need to be deconstructed and overcome. We need to rethink these superimposed binaries. And most importantly, we need criticism to be found beyond critical courses, courses and spaces specifically designed by the institution where critical thought is acceptable. I mean, this is what I find troublesome all the time is the institution, the racist institution, creates a space where it's acceptable to talk about race. And I think by kind of reclaiming space, reclaiming our right to the classroom, reclaiming our right to the campus, to the city, even, is a really good approach to dealing with this massive problem. And relegating social criticism to these spaces that criticism is expected is pointless at best and suppressive at worst. And that's how I'm going to start the conversation.
Thanks so much, Parsa. We'll move on to Dr. Scribe.
Thank you so much for your warm and generous introduction, Dr. Park, and for your land acknowledgement. I just want to extend appreciation to Dr. Reece for opening this discussion by locating the classroom within the broader white supremacist context from which we learn and teach, and as well extend some appreciation to Parsa for zooming into the actual classroom. I don't know where I fit in terms of the zooming in, but what I will say is that I believe that all of these social factors, race, racism, indigeneity, anti-indigeneity, they are manifest in the classroom, but I don't see the classroom as a neutral container for racism. Rather, I recognize the classroom itself as a form of spatial and ideological violence and oppression, both historically and presently. So as many or some of you know, there isn't one singular Canadian education system. Racial segregation continues to define Canada's approach to education as far back as 1867 with the British North American Act that outlines the division of powers between the federal government and the provinces. So while the provinces are responsible for Canadian education and designing it, administering it for Canadian citizens, it's the federal government who is responsible for First Nations children's education. And while most provinces have their own Education Act, the federal government is largely reliant on the Indian Act to guide its approach to elementary and secondary education. This is a practice that has existed for over 100 years, and that has reaching consequences that extend into the post-secondary level. So if we look at the problem of post-secondary education and racism in the classroom, I think a good place to begin that examination is by looking to the predecessor of the Indian Act, which is still in existence today. But the predecessor, which is the Gradual Enfranchisement Act from 1869, treated indigeneity as antithetical to higher education. In this act, it stated that any Indian man who sought a post-secondary education would automatically be enfranchised as a Canadian citizen, meaning he would no longer be entitled to treaty rights. He would no longer be considered an Indian under the meaning of the Indian Act. And of course, because patriarchy, misogyny, this extended to that man's family. So if a status Indian man was enfranchised and was married and had children, his partner, his children would also become Canadian citizens and denied access to their treaty rights. These are historical examples of anti-indigeneity, white supremacy, racism that helped define and shape the classroom and help define and shape indigeneity. But I can say with absolute certainty, there are plenty of present-day examples of racism, white supremacy, anti-indigeneity, anti-Blackness in the classroom. I'll leave it there for now, but I'm looking forward to diving deeper into this.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Scribe, and thank you for framing it around white supremacy and drawing from what Dr. Reece and Parsa were saying to name white supremacy as being central to the conversation and the classroom as a violent space. We'll move on to Hun and then Hela.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you, and thank you for having me here. I'm presenting today from Treaty 6 territory, Amisquachi Waskaikan, which is currently known as Edmonton. I am grateful to live and study as a Korean immigrant on this land, which is traditional territories of many First Nations such as Cree, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Dene, Blackfoot, and Saulteaux. Thank you so much for Dr. Scribe and other panelists. I would like to talk about the syllabus and the underrepresentations of the racialized faculties in specifically in arts and humanities, because that's where I'm coming from. Like in the previous session, Dr. Amy also talked about the model minority, where the Asian faculties are, and we often found them in, still not enough, but still we often find them in STEM, business, medicine, and law, but very extremely underrepresented in arts and humanities. And the demographic data of faculty, our own institution, and such as that quote, arts is outperforming the university overall when it comes to recruiting and retaining equity-deserving faculty members, with the visible minority group the outlier, quote. I believe that this phenomenon is not specific to our institution, but something that is shared by many faculty of arts and humanities in Canadian universities. There will be so many systematic and cultural factors that cause these underrepresentations of racialized faculties in arts and humanities, and I'm not in the position to talk about all of that. However, as a graduate student and instructor, I found that the Eurocentrism in arts and humanities is one of the main factors that promote continued recruitment of Caucasian faculties over racialized faculties and forces instructors of color to navigate self-censorship in terms of their teaching and research. First, there is very little critique and collective efforts to dismantle the Eurocentric curriculum and culture at school. And second, there is a racial bias, which assumes instructors of color are less qualified to teach Eurocentric materials, which leads to less opportunity for racialized applicants or instructors. And third, if non-white instructor or faculty tries to decolonize their course by including theories and literatures of people of color, they often face resistance and negative evaluations from students, which is the reality that we have to deal with. In this dynamic, the racialized instructors are rarely visible in classrooms. And if they are present, their vulnerable positions do not allow them to fully engage with the decolonization of the curriculum or classroom to the degree they would like. Like the justice works are so crucial, but in reality, students, instructors, faculties of color live in anxiety and fear under the institutional system because we have to be hired, which is so rare. And we have to, like, as an instructor, how much can I do the social justice work when I'm evaluating under this Eurocentric framework and the perspective. I would want to mention just one more part, that how this also hurts not only the course structure or curriculum, but also interpersonal evaluation of the racialized instructors, which again can lead to less opportunities. For example, based on Western perspectives and values, Asian scholars are often framed as silent, happy working bees. In other words, like these perspective leads to the negative assumptions that towards their leadership, their initiative attitudes, and their social skills. So I want to ask if the current Canadian system and process for hiring and evaluating faculty aren't promoting these unconscious biases to play in the hiring process. For instance, are there questions around linguistic delivery in the classroom, the dinner interviews, like during the recruitment process, or those like hurting specific race? Yeah, I will end my thoughts there. Looking forward to more discussion.
Thank you so much, Hun. And last but not least, Hela.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be joining you all today. I'd first of all like to thank you all for speaking on your land acknowledgement, and I will also be speaking on my status as a settler as we continue during this panel. I'm also very glad that we have been given incredible discretion in our ways of interpreting this question, as you can see through everybody else's answers. I'd like to draw on Sarah Ahmed, and she's an incredible scholar, and really I want to draw on her work on space, identity, and inheritance, and what bodies are afforded mobility within the classroom, what bodies instead react with friction, that are restrained, become hypervisibilized within these spaces. I want to use the term gaslight to describe this next phenomenon. The classroom is oftentimes conceptualized as the safe space, a space that is tolerant, that is equitable, where we can have polite and very sincere academic debate. But unfortunately, this isn't the lived reality. And being told consistently that it is often a very jarring experience for somebody. I feel like the threshold for the classroom instead is actually quite violent, particularly when you're stripped of the many tools that you've grown accustomed to in terms of navigating very hostile racist spaces. And instead, you're being told to really confine yourself and conform yourself to a very narrow framework in order to assert your identity or your belongingness, or sometimes even your right to life within these spaces. So instead, I'd like to ask the question of, for whom is this space then safe? I would also like to just then say that the burden of justification is what you must carry then as a student of color within these spaces. And you don't really learn much when you have this incredible anxiety overbearing you within the classroom. Instead, what you might learn is how fast your heart can beat in certain situations. For myself, that burden is being representative of Afghan women, which is a strange thing to do because I'm not representative of all Afghan women. And yet a lot of the times, something that I'm persistently arguing within the classroom is the cultural politics of occupation in relation to Afghanistan. So really particularly critiquing Western liberal feminist notions of intervention as a catalyst for development, and instead really extending complexity to the Afghan political imaginary, which is really important to myself. Afghanistan, for me, a lot of the times it's being referred to as the graveyard of empires. And I believe it is through this conceptualization that in turn, what we get is Afghan lives bearing very little significance as living within a state of almost preordained death. And so for me, in my approach to dismantling anti-Asian racism is also recognizing how it manifests in our imperial efforts abroad and the neo-colonial projects that may take place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hela. That was absolutely amazing. And I think that as a group, from hearing everyone speak, we have established or situated the classroom as a white supremacist violent space in terms of the context of white settler colonialism, white settler imperialism, white settler capitalism. And considering that we have done this, I would like to ask, how can we create anti-racist decolonial classrooms? And the first person that I'd like to ask to speak to this, considering that we have situated the classroom as being this violent white supremacist imperial space, is Hun, if you can, please.
Yeah, in my understanding, anti-racist and decolonial classrooms are not just a safe or safer place for racialized students, but also it is a place where active dismantling of the racial hierarchy and entitlement and privilege that creates racial violences and oppressions, as everyone talked about already. And I'm in the early stage of my learning what anti-racist or decolonial classroom pedagogy, course materials, and structure can look like. So I acknowledge my current opinions could be rough or maybe superficial. However, I do hope that for a classroom where students and teachers don't get mentally and physically exhausted from daily based navigation of the micro and macro aggressions related to their race. As a student of color and teacher of color, we should explore rigorously the practical ways in which our course materials and structures reflect the path of racial justice movements paid by many scholars, educators, artists, and activists. And a simple way we'll be reviewing and mindfully choosing whose theories, whose literature are we asking students to read and learn and watch. A more obvious area will be the enactment of pedagogy that can empower the voice of marginalized students and show allyship to the oppressed. What I hope to get better at as an instructor is that I can better monitor the unspoken oppression and the conflicts between students by noticing diverse body languages, the energy change, and I can find effective ways to intervene in those oppressive environments or moments. I realized that my cognitive energy and attention was constantly drawing to the loudest, the entitled students in the classroom as someone who is going to be affected by their evaluation in my first year of teaching, right? So because they're loud and they're taking space in the classroom, lots of instructors constantly focusing on them, which should be the opposite. So while seeking the support and care for ourselves as an instructors, we should use every opportunity to challenge the enacted privilege and the entitlement in the classroom, even though they're energy consuming and uncomfortable. I'm still learning how to live with that discomfort in the classroom, and I would like to learn more about how to effectively counter white supremacy in the classroom and how to empower those who are often silenced. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Hun, for that really thoughtful response. And just a reminder that we will be having a Q&A session. So if you do have any questions for the speakers or just questions in general, then please feel free to type those into the chat. And next we will have Dr. Scribe speaking about how do we create anti-racist and decolonial classrooms.
Thank you. So I realize what I'm about to say may ring hollow for many, given that this is coming from myself, a tenure track faculty member at a university, but maybe the classroom, as we know it, cannot be saved. Maybe we need to completely dismantle the classroom, bring it down to its individual pieces, examine all of those pieces, and ask ourselves, what's working here? What's not working? And we need to collectively redesign a learning space that confronts some of the issues that we're addressing today. So having said that, I do want to speak to two guiding forces in my life, which is one is the need to address our basic lived needs and the difference between radical transformation. And I see those as two separate, distinct, but important things that Indigenous peoples needs and many other groups in this country. So I see social inclusion as being things like addressing the high rates at which Indigenous folks are charged with nonviolent crimes, for example, or having access to clean water or food, housing. And I see radical transformation as something that has all of those components, but also recognizes Indigenous peoples as sovereign nations that are not nations under Canada, but standalone, not the nesting doll situation that we have now. So in order to address the immediate needs within the classroom, I think it's important to, reflect on what Parsa was saying in the first question, actually looking at what are the dynamics that are taking place in the classroom. But just in terms of radical transformation, which is my end goal, I want to think through Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang's I don't know if this is an appropriate metaphor, groundbreaking article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I just want to read the opening line where they write, decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. And I understand decolonization as defined and illustrated in this article. Decolonization is the end of dispossessing Indigenous peoples of land and life. It is not about butts in seats. It's not about updating the curriculum. It's about the ground that that classroom sits on. So I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Scribe. And next we have Parsa.
I could not agree more, Dr. Scribe. I was so happy that you brought up Tuck and Yang. I've also noticed an increasing tendency to accept metonymic de-radicalization in discussions about racism and constituting decolonization as a metaphor, quite a distance away from its territorial constitution. Anti-racism especially is often equivalent to representation and diversity in a lot of these spaces as well, where they invoke, representational politics and diversifying, for example, a curriculum as, an act of anti-racism or decolonization. And I think that actually hinders a lot of progress. But beyond politicizing the classroom, I think making unlearning an affordable and tangible process is really important. Students who struggle with their socioeconomic status, racialized students especially, look to accumulate knowledge quite literally. So something as like something that'll save them from impending poverty. And if we desire emancipation, we really need to confront Homo economicus. We really need to confront the way our society treats people, like on a grand scale. And I, again, could not agree more with Dr. Scribe. Working class, lower income students can't afford to be critical a lot of times of the like and unlearn problematic narratives. They can't be critical of them or unlearn them because their main concern is putting food on the table, and that's where most of the pain is inflicted. Imagine going to a place where critical thought is invoked as a given, yet all you can do is fight for survival or think about how you have to secure the bag because, for example, housing insecurity is a thing and such a pervasive problem. If you want to have shelter, you have to sacrifice um, actually solving issues. So you look to address the symptom. Um, so I think rather than constantly addressing the symptoms of racism and colonization, we need to look for the solution. Um, and I think that is, again, that's where I'm going to leave it off.
Okay, thanks so much, Parsa. And I guess I'm getting from what you're saying that the solution involves centering Indigenous peoples. But that's just my 2 cents. We'll move on to Hela.
Thank you, everyone. For those of us that are not Indigenous to this land, I believe we must begin with recognizing our settler status and our positionality. And I realize that a lot of this time it can be difficult and deeply difficult for some people that feel disadvantaged by their many intersecting identities. But we cannot decolonize a space without first recognizing that our continued existence on occupied land, whether we approve of it or not, is oppression in itself. And I completely agree with what Dr. Scribe said, as well as Parsa. We begin with dismantling the classroom. The physical space of the classroom, the way that it is being built, with a professor at the very front lecturing for sometimes 2 to 3 hours while students just take in information without any really critical debate and dynamic taking place in the classroom. There are heavy power dynamics in place. I think one of the main issues is when we don't completely dismantle, when we try to make minor changes within something, when there's not complete abolishment, what we have is reorganization of almost interior design or furniture within a prison. What we instead aim to do is recognize that these spaces themselves are colonial legacies that need to be completely brought down to their very foundations. I know I come from a criminology background, so a huge thing for me was trying to incorporate Indigenous perspectives such as healing circles within our current criminal justice system. And that has been incredibly impossible. And the impossibility is not that alternate Indigenous worldviews and perspectives are incorrect, but rather you are taking these perspectives and you're inserting them into incredibly hostile environments. So you're setting these perspectives up for failure. And instead, then what you're doing is, once these perspectives fail, is you're relegating them to a lesser status. And that's the main issue. So instead, what we should do is we should completely start with what Dr. Scribe and Parsa both described as completely taking it down from where we're at and just kind of going from there, I guess.
Thank you so much, Hela. And I also come from a criminology background, as I believe Dr. Reece does as well. And of course, one of the debates in criminology is abolition versus reform. So I'd love to hear what Dr. Reece has to say about this question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And incredible comments. I was actually going to talk about abolition. I want to answer this question from the positionality of a Black Caribbean diasporic woman whose people were taken from land and literally deposited, and I do mean that in the racial capitalist sense, on land stolen from people. And so intentionality is so incredibly important, and political will. And I want to dovetail off of what my colleague and friend has so eloquently talked about, and also offer up a language, the use of language in a different way. So I'm going to borrow from Alirezaei here, who talks about not dismantling, but rupturing. And when I think about rupturing and the concept of rupturing, I automatically think about abolition and the way in which we tear down those walls and we create from the ground up a groundswell of learning and of an ontological action and what it means to actually ask ourselves, what is the purpose and the use value of the classroom space? Dr. Scribe and I co-teach a course called Colonialism and Anti-Blackness. And we are co-conspirators in our pedagogical practice, and we have carefully crafted this course in such a way that an Indigenous and a Black woman have come together to not only talk about the beauty of our own respective backgrounds, but also the tensions and the conflicts and what it actually means to intentionally demonstrate and pedagogically practice decolonization in the classroom. We try and model this philosophically every single week we go into our classroom. We have designed our assignments around that practice and that thinking, that methodological and that theoretical thinking and grounding. And so I also want to answer this question by asking a question, and that is, what is the use value of the classroom? How do folks interrogate whiteness and white supremacy within the context of the classroom? If you don't interrogate it, ask yourself why you are choosing not to have that conversation or not to interrogate it, or to not to divest from whiteness and white supremacy in the context of the construction of your curriculum in your pedagogical practice. And so I want to also borrow from the work of Rennie Ito Lodge, who's a Black British author. She wrote the book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And she asks the question, how has your education betrayed you? And I've asked my students this question over and over again to have them think about the ways in which they have sought and taken up space in the classroom or felt they couldn't take up space. And so I think in answering this question, our decolonial practice or praxis, if you will, is really about how we see the use value of the classroom. We need to rupture the space, abolish the space, create a groundswell, right? That's grounded in, I think Parsa mentioned, the reality of capitalism and class and who has access to the space and how they move in and through the space. And also, as Hela mentioned, this idea of the authoritative figure in the classroom being the all-knowing entity at the front, who is the faculty member or the professor, right? And what that looks like.
Thanks so much, Dr. Reece. And I think at this point, just because there has been quite a bit of comment about breaking down the classroom, rupturing the classroom, and there is a question about that. So I think at this point, it would be a good time to ask that question. And it is from Rita Damoon. And she asks, referring specifically to Dr. Scribe, but also Dr. Reece has since talked about rupturing the classroom and rupturing the space. So going off what you said about decolonization as the material ground we teach in, can you share some examples of breaking down the classroom? So Dr. Scribe, as well as anyone else who would like to talk about, what does that look like, rupturing the space, breaking down the classroom? And I'll send it off to you first, Dr. Scribe.
Thank you so much. And it's a fantastic question. So just thinking off the cuff, I really appreciate and model my own teaching practice after different forms of public education. So I used to be a youth leader with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. And this is a for youth, by youth movement that was committed to establishing connections between reproductive justice, indigeneity, decolonization, rooted in Indigenous youth's experiences. So that is my entry point into the material dismantling of the classroom. This education followed a curriculum that was designed by the youth. The physical space was wherever we could find. The physical classroom, if we're using that framework, would be land-based, or even just not even a romantic idea of being on the land. Sometimes it's in your city auntie's backyard, or on someone's balcony, or around a kitchen table. I know the kitchen table is it's a transformative space that it cuts across many different cultures. Your auntie's sitting at the table having maybe a tea or a coffee or a cigarette, and that's where a lot of the theorization gets done. So I see those as the material ways that we are moving beyond the classroom as we know it. There's also a lot of great initiatives happening right now. So there's one of my colleagues, Riley Kucherin, is involved with Deshinta, which is a land-based school that invites community members to work with each other and then establish a relationship with the land that is profoundly different than how our relationship with the land looks now, which is mostly defined as property and transactional and extractive. And then, of course, I appreciate the initiatives that are occurring through Yellowhead Institute, which is an Indigenous-based think tank that I'm involved with, where they host a freedom school for Indigenous youth. So, I mean, there's so many more examples. So I'm going to open it up to my colleagues here to just help fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Anyone else who would like to speak to this? What would it look like? Or what does it look like, breaking down the classroom, rupturing the classroom, if the classroom is this violent white supremacist space?
I wouldn't mind adding some comments to this question. And I think similar to what Dr. Scribe has said, I come from a community-based background where for many, many years I did frontline work with folks who were incarcerated, with prisoners inside of carceral spaces as well as outside of them. And some of my greatest teachings and learnings came from those folks, came from folks who really helped me hone my craft and understanding of what it means to employ an abolitionist ideology and mentality. And it's not a utopian idea. Abolition is not a utopian concept. And when we talk about abolition, we're really talking about abolition of the educational system, the school to prison pipeline, the healthcare system, the refugee and immigration system, all of these social structural systems in our society that are ingrained and embedded, that have the arc of white supremacy upholding them. And so for me, what it looks like, similar to my colleague, Dr. Scribe, is it really entails bringing in a different way of thinking and knowing and learning about our social environment. So I have often brought in folks from community to speak to my class. I've brought in folks who are formerly incarcerated to speak to my class. But that has been crafted in a way, and I continually try and craft this in a way that does not exact a voyeuristic quality. And I always ask folks before they come into my classroom, whatever their comfort level is in terms of what they want to impart, they have that autonomy. Because I also recognize that classrooms, particularly university spaces, they have been created to stand alone and apart from our society, but also then being seen simultaneously as a part of our society. But there's a hierarchy that's been created. So it's like Parsa mentioned, there is a dissonance, a diagnostic gaze that only certain folks can get there. Only certain folks have the right to be there. And so in bridging that gap in a decolonization, a decolonial sense, it's incumbent upon us as educators and as community members to bridge that divide, to work, cognitively just empower the folks that we're bringing into those spaces, right? And giving them autonomy and giving our students a lens in which they can enter into conversations that are difficult and challenging from a different vantage point, right?
Thank you so much, Dr. Reece. And I'm not sure if anyone else has something that they would add to that, Hela, Parsa, or Hun. And if not, then I'll move on to another question. You're all okay? One thing I just wanted to add in terms of Dr. Reece's question about what is the use value of the classroom, or what is the whole purpose of education? And I'm just thinking in terms of drawing on Indigenous law and how Indigenous law is really described as, drawing on John Burroughs, learning about our relations with one another and with the land. and how that classroom should also be that as well, learning about our relationships with each other in the land. And I just say that because Dr. Reece mentioned like hierarchy, and of course that's more the Western knowledge systems, but also that we need to be in relation, how important relationship is, and that's really drawing on Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and how Indigenous law is also tied to learning from the land. So I just want to say that and connecting to what Dr. Scribe was saying as well in terms of learning from the land, and that has to be central in the classroom. And perhaps that's one way to decolonize or rupture the space. And I think there is another question here. Nicholas Lee pushes further asking, I would like to hear more about how the speaker's classroom assignments, how they differ from what we're used to. So perhaps for the students, this might look like, what would you like to see that is different with concrete examples? So someone wants concrete examples. Nicholas Lee would like concrete examples of how exactly do you do this in the classroom, doing things differently. And Hun,
I think Dr.
Parsa?
Scribe go.
I was muted, unfortunately. Yeah, I was gonna say lessen the workload as an instructor. If you look at the work that full-time students who aren't working are, that they have to deal with all the final projects and final exams at the same time. I think lessening the workload is really important, and making things project-oriented rather than exam-oriented is really, really important. I notice in a lot of I don't know, classrooms that are more pedagogically aware about race and class and gender and sexuality, they tend to have a final project that students spend a lot of the classroom time trying to understand. And through that lens, right? It's kind of trying to understand the whole through the particular, right? It's a very simple thing. You can't, it's so difficult for students to accumulate. I mean, that's the problem. You're trying to, and again, I go back to Paulo Freire. It's amazing. It's a banking system. So what happens in our classrooms all the time is there's an act of depositing knowledge, and exams are a horrendous example of this. It's like students won't even remember most of the material they interact with because they're constantly overwhelmed with information that is unnecessary. And so I think, making courses project oriented, having more communication between, having more like intercourse communication between like instructors where they can kind of manage the workload of students, because a lot of students will end up taking a bunch of different courses. And working class students have to work while they're taking on courses, so all that work, they won't be able to interact with the literature appropriately, participate in the discussions, actively facilitate dialogue. To do that, you need to rethink how the entire course is planned. And I talked about critical thought existing at the margins. That is something immediate. That is something that we have to deal with immediately. For example, if you have a bunch of final like exams and projects and essays, a bunch of them, do at the same time at the end of the course, and then you also have in the last 2 weeks of the course, critical thought, feminist analysis, gender theory. What's more likely to happen? Students like having a sudden realization mid burnout that they need to reflect critically on everything they've learned, like to unlearn basically everything they've learned the past, like couple of weeks. No, that's not the case. They ingrain, like unlearning is structurally excluded through the structure of the classroom. And we need to really revitalize dialogue within the classroom, making it project oriented, getting students to examine particulars through or examine universality through particulars. I think that is a great way to go. Like that's a real, even though that sounds abstract, it's a very concrete way to go about doing this. Just Like that is a simple step that we can take. I feel I would love to hear other panelists' comments on this.
I think
Hun,
Dr. Scribe. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Park. Sorry. Oh, Hun, were you going to? I apologize.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I was just going to add another point like that Parsa brought up about the working class students. And as someone who researched on aging and the age norms, I was also going to brought up about the issue of like the age in the university classroom. Like yesterday, there was news about the oldest Canadian student who achieved their master's at their age at 87. Like for the first, like that is the oldest person. Like, and there are like as an instructor, we actually meet. They are so minority, like in terms of number, but we meet those students who actually come back to university at their later stage of their life with several multiple reasons, right? And in terms of the workload you talked about, like there is also the in terms of the temporality, like what the speed and the tempo of this university system that requires so much burden and it puts pressure on the students. Like Josiah, I wanted to brought that up because there are so many intersectionality that plays in the classroom that I totally appreciate the terms that rupturing the classroom. Like, yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hun. And did you still want to speak, Dr. Reece?
I was just going to quickly add that I think Dr. Scribe and I smiled on cue when this question was asked, because this is exactly what we are doing in our class, in our colonialism anti-Blackness class, where we don't have any essays. We have created a 5-part digital project for students to create, where they can use music, they can create playlists, they can use documentaries, it's completely up to them. And it really speaks to what Parsa was saying around the creativity that students can tap into. And what was interesting is there was an element of trepidation, quite a few moments of trepidation and fear, because students have been so conditioned that the only way to attain marks is through writing a 7-8 page paper. So when Dr. Scribe and I began telling students about this, there was so much dis-ease in our classroom about how they were going to do this. And they're not creative, and there's A, B, and C, and all these pieces. And we were like, hold on. This is an opportunity to learn something in a different way. It's completely social justice focused. There's an opportunity for you to think about your learning and engage in your learning in a non-traditional canon-like way. And so this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of our decolonial practice. We are intentionally trying to model this and implement this and impart this to our students in every single, whether it's our teaching or the assignments. So I don't know, Dr. Schaub, if you want to add anything in regard to that as well.
Yeah, I would love to. So everything you just said, Dr. Reece, but just to build on my earlier comment that my entry point into the classroom as a faculty member was through public education. It's through youth-based, youth-led grassroots movements. So assignments didn't really exist in the way that I create and co-create them. Assignments in the context of public education looked like applying for grants so that we had money for honoraria, for food, for a roof. It looked like taking care of the land, tending to the land, and tending to each other. So I come from a really practical space where I want the work that we do in the classroom to actually have a function beyond it. I don't know if I come from like a really pragmatic or practical people, or if it's just my family. But my goal in working with Dr. Reece in our co-constructed classroom is to create works or support the students in creating works that they can take with them beyond the classroom. So, for example, we suggest make your own syllabus. Maybe you're interested in education one day. Maybe you want to create that syllabus, or maybe write a blog or create your own meme series so you can become an influencer, whatever it is. We want this work to have a life outside of our classroom. So I definitely hear and appreciate what I'm hearing all of my peers and collaborators say right now. So thank you so much for the question, Nicholas.
Go ahead, Hela.
So those were some wonderful points that everybody made. I'd just like to start off by saying that institutions, laws, much of what we are being told is objective and rather unbiased is often very untrue. The classroom may be a very incredibly hostile space for most people. The classroom is also imagined as a space for the national subject. And so those of us whose identities may be at odds will feel that hostility more. Inequalities that exist outside the classroom may also manifest themselves within the classroom. And so where whiteness outside of the classroom is afforded a great deal of grace, as well as whiteness kind of inheriting social capital, is something that Parsa spoke to as well. These are not abstract privileges. They can manifest in real, tangible skills. So things such as having confidence in speaking abilities from white students, as well as an ease in knowing that their opinions in these spaces are not reflected or representative of their race or ethnicity as a whole, but just their individual politics. And I'm very appreciative to Han and what she was saying, that within her classroom, she's becoming more mindful of the students that are quiet, who is omitted, who isn't speaking, and particularly students of color that are a little bit more quiet. I just want to give a quick shout out to one of my professors, Melissa Williams at the University of Toronto. She's wonderful in that case for creating a very safe space for her students within the classroom to be able to speak on subject matters, as well as I remember recently there was a student that actually started coughing and he got up and he left class, and she paused the class and she got up and left and checked on him. And when she came back, she said, what kind of a professor would I be if I didn't check up on him? And I was perplexed because I'd never seen a professor do that before. And so sometimes it's just acts of kindness and being perceptive of your students and really kind of extending humanity to them as not just students that can, like Parsa was saying, you have to read a book, 2 books for each class every single week, kind of understanding of their social circumstances, as well as that's a small act that you can do. And I think for a lot of students, that would mean the world.
I wonder whether I can contribute a couple more cents just in terms of the practical part. I know one thing that I've started to do recently is always make it clear on the syllabus, and also when I'm talking about the syllabus, that that sexual violence is a grounds for extension, those types of statements, that if you have, experienced a trauma or racial or sexual violence, or that that is a grounds for receiving an extension assignment, and that you don't need to give me particulars, but that just to make that clear. And also in some readings, I will tell the students that there's some graphic moments of violence, and that if they choose not to read that, or it's up to them whether they want to read it or not, that they don't have to, and make sure that that doesn't become part of the requirements of the class to re-traumatize yourself. So perhaps that's some practical. We have only a few minutes, and considering that the theme of this conference is building solidarity, I'm wondering whether someone or one or two people could talk about how do we build healthy allyship. And I think clearly Dr. Reece and Dr. Scribe are currently doing that. But if anyone else has some thoughts about how does building solidarity, what does it look like? What is healthy allyship? And I'm thinking primarily amongst racialized, Indigenous, and Black people, actually.
Maybe I can go first. I would like to answer this question with a quote I really liked. An Indigenous queer author and poet and anti-oppression consultant, Gabe Calderon, stated in an EDI workshop that about dismantling systematic oppression, And that starts from, quote, active radical love for people and humanity. Like we just briefly talked about humanity and love. So it's like that idea of active and radical love, what that looks like. Just I am grateful that I have found, like, just it's my fifth year in Canada, but I have met few allies who are, I would identify my ally that is so grateful for someone who is newcomer to Canada. But also I still witness those moments of white savior moments that some might think it as that is an act of allyship. Like that, I know that allyship is very complicated, tricky in practice. But yes, I think those, as what we mentioned, that small moments of kindness, small moments of the love, genuine love towards one another, the relational, just really human to human. That is how we should approach to the allyship, rather than it's just responsibility or the duty that we have to do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hun. I don't know if anyone needs to say something. We only have about a minute left. If not, I will thank everyone. Anyone need to absolutely say something in 10, 20 seconds? Okay, Hela, go ahead.
Quick add-on, I just wanted to say that I think that the key term here is healthy, and for allyship to be healthy, it has to be not conditional, and it can't be transactional, and just through understanding our collective struggle as a whole that we can move towards liberation. I think that's what's important.
That was amazing. Thanks so much for adding that, Hela. That is, I think, is exactly what we needed. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us for this plenary, particularly a special thank you to the speakers. And next up is a break, or you could also have a networking session. And I believe information on what that is available on the website, or perhaps Avella could put it in the chat. And there's about 45 minutes, and then the next session will begin at 12:45 Pacific, 3:45 Eastern, and we can't forget 1:45 Mountain Time, and that is disrupting the status quo, mobilizing action to address anti-Asian racism. Thank you, everyone.